You're watching Light Behind Bars, where real crime meets powerful redemption. Every story here is inspired by true events brought to life through deep emotion and fiction. If you're ready to explore the human side of justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. Stephen Port, a name that would later cast a chilling shadow over the cold streets of London, began life as an ordinary child in a seemingly unremarkable family in Southend-on-Sea, Essex. His childhood was not painted with the vibrant hues of laughter and carefree innocence. Instead, it bore a muted, grayish tone, an unsettling stillness where emotions seemed suppressed or, worse, non-existent. He was a quiet, reserved boy, often retreating into his own private world, a realm that the adults around him, perhaps too preoccupied with their own concerns, either could not or chose not to enter. Even in those early years, there were faint signs, subtle ripples disturbing the placid surface of his outward demeanor. These were not overt acts of rebellion or mischief, but a sophisticated solitude, an invisible barrier Stephen erected between himself and the world. He observed more than he participated, listened more than he shared. At times, his eyes would flicker with an elusive, piercing gaze, a cold, penetrating scrutiny that left others uneasy, as if their deepest secrets were being laid bare. But that spark would quickly fade, replaced by his usual mask of indifference. In the rare moments, he joined in childish games. Stephen showed a tendency to control and orchestrate everything to his liking, even in the smallest details. A quiet irritation would surface if things didn't go his way, not explosive anger, but a heavy, brooding silence, a furrowed brow that defied explanation. It was easy to dismiss as childish stubbornness, a fleeting quirk, yet, in hindsight, these were perhaps early signs of a pathological need for control, a desire to impose his will on others, even in the most harmless of circumstances. School offered no refuge for connection. Stephen drifted through his academic years like a shadow, unremarkable, unobtrusive, leaving no lasting impression. This very ordinariness became the perfect disguise for the turmoil brewing beneath. He mastered the art of concealing his true emotions, donning a mask of normalcy, even shyness, beneath that facade. A seed of difference, perhaps deviance, quietly took root in the barren soil of his soul. No dramatic trauma marked Stephen Port's childhood, no overt abuse or neglect that could be pointed to as the definitive cause. The darkness within him formed more subtly, like a slow poison seeping through the cracks of a loveless existence, fed by the indifference of those around him and a profound sense of alienation. The mundane normalcy of his environment may have stifled any chance for his inner abnormalities to surface or be addressed, allowing them to fester like an undetected malignancy. In the Port household, silence often reigned, not the silence of peace, but of unspoken truths and suppressed emotions. Stephen might have spent hours alone in his room, his thoughts and actions a mystery. Perhaps he was crafting a fantasy world where he held absolute dominion, where everything bent to his will. Or perhaps he was simply sinking into an expanding void, a growing emptiness that threatened to swallow the last flickers of light within him. Stories of adolescent isolation are not uncommon, but Stephen's carried a darker hue. It wasn't merely the reticence of an introverted boy, it hinted at a calculated reserve. He seemed to understand early on that maintaining distance, keeping others at arm's length, granted him a certain advantage, a vantage point for observation, for gathering information, and perhaps for manipulation. This silent poison, nurtured by loneliness, emotional disconnection, and an untouched inner world, grew unchecked. No one saw it, no one suspected, until it was strong enough to extend its toxic tendrils into the outside world, sowing terror and death. Stephen Port's childhood was not an explanation, but it was a piece of the darkness, the opening chapter of a tragic novel about a serial killer. The first cracks in his soul had appeared, faint and barely noticeable, but they were there, waiting for a catalyst, a push, to shatter into an abyss. And that abyss was slowly beginning to open, awaiting its first prey. Stephen Port's adolescence passed in a haze of obscurity, but it was not without its undercurrents of turmoil, a pivotal factor in shaping his fractured psyche, though not openly discussed or recorded as a clear trauma, was his growing awareness of his sexual orientation in a society not yet fully accepting. This was not a sudden event, but a gradual, internal reckoning, fraught with confusion, fear, and perhaps shame, especially in the context of those formative years. The belief in a normal life, like that of his peers, or in conforming to preordained societal molds, began to crack from within. In a world where difference was often met with scrutiny or outright hostility, Stephen's realization that he was attracted to the same sex carved a deep fissure in his fragile psyche. He may have tried to ignore it, to force himself into the mold of normalcy, but his true nature resisted suppression. This internal struggle between his authentic self and the image he believed society demanded planted a profound sense of alienation. An isolation far deeper than his introverted tendencies alone could explain. His faith in acceptance from family, friends, or the community began to erode. He started to view those around him through a different lens, wondering if they could be trusted with his secret or if they would reject or judge him. This suspicion seeped like poison into his relationships, rendering them shallow and insincere. Stephen learned to build ever stronger walls around himself, not just to conceal his sexual orientation, but to shield a heart that was growing increasingly calloused from the weight of self-imposed expectations and perceived societal demands. This was not a trauma in the conventional sense, no dramatic abuse or shocking event. It was a subtler wound, a betrayal of faith and safety, belonging, and the possibility of unconditional love. When these foundational beliefs crumbled, it left him cynical, bitter, and driven to seek control in destructive ways to compensate for his sense of powerlessness. For Stephen, the inability to fully embrace his identity may have led to a splintering of his personality. On one hand, he maintained a facade of normalcy, even blandness. On the other, his suppressed desires and yearnings found outlets in the shadows, in private spaces where he could escape judgment. The internet, with its veil of anonymity, later became fertile ground for this darker side to flourish. This betrayal of trust did not come from a single individual, but from a broader system of values and a social climate where Stephen felt he had no place. This sense of being an outsider may have fueled a quiet rage, a craving for recognition, even if through the most perverse means, if the real world wouldn't accept his true self. Perhaps he could create another one where he held the reins, where he could indulge his desires without fear of judgment. This fracture extended beyond self-acceptance, reshaping how he approached relationships. If honesty and vulnerability could lead to pain and rejection, then deception and manipulation might be more effective tools to achieve his desires. His belief in human goodness and mutual trust gradually gave way to a cynical worldview, where every interaction was a potential power play, a transaction. There's no evidence Stephen turned to religion or spirituality for solace or redemption during this period. Perhaps negative experiences eroded any faith in something beyond himself and his immediate desires. Or perhaps he sought answers but found none, deepening the chasm in his soul. This prolonged, silent turning point reshaped Stephen's psychological landscape. It didn't directly transform him into a killer, but it created fertile ground for darker seeds to take root. Loneliness, a sense of betrayal, repression, and a hunger for control swirled together into a toxic vortex, awaiting only a spark to ignite. This fracture of faith, like an insidious current, eroded the moral foundation of Stephen's being, making it easier for him to slide down the path of depravity. He began to see the world through a warped lens, where empathy withered and personal desires reigned supreme. The road to his first crime was no longer distant, paved with the shards of a trust that had been deeply wounded. The darkness within Stephen Port was no longer confined to smoldering thoughts or vague feelings of alienation. It began to stir, demanding a tangible presence in the real world. His intense desires, nurtured in solitude and fueled by shattered trust, now sought release through concrete actions. The fragile line between a warped imagination and brutal reality started to blur. And Stephen, with chilling intent, took his first steps down a path of depravity, a path from which retreat would become nearly impossible. His initial crimes were not impulsive murders, but calculated descents, rooted in a craving for control and the indulgence of perverse sexual urges, with gamma-hydroxybutyrate, or GHB, becoming his sinister tool, a toxic key unlocking the door to his darkest intentions. GHB, a chemical acting on the central nervous system, carried a dangerous duality in small doses. It could induce relaxation, sociability, even heightened arousal qualities that made it appealing in certain circles, but in higher doses. It transformed into a lethal weapon, capable of stripping away consciousness, causing temporary amnesia, and, in the worst cases, leading to coma or death. Stephen, through anonymous internet forums or whispered secrets in the shadowy corners of the communities he frequented, quickly grasped the drug's potential. It was not just a stimulant, but a means to neutralize resistance, to manipulate and dominate another person entirely. His first crimes likely unfolded in the privacy of encounters arranged through gay dating apps and websites. Stephen, with his quiet, almost unassuming demeanor, may not have exuded immediate charisma, yet he possessed a terrifying calm and an unwavering focus. He targeted young men, often newcomers to London, lonely souls, or those seeking casual, uncommitted encounters. An invitation for a relaxed evening, a special drink to spice things up, became his lure. A sophisticated trap cloaked in feigned hospitality. The moment he slipped a tasteless, odorless dose of GHB into an unsuspecting partner's drink. His heart likely beat with an unnatural rhythm, a mix of fear of discovery and the thrill of unprecedented power. He watched, cold and meticulous, as his victims' clarity faded, their speech slurred, their body went limp, and their consciousness drifted into an undefined void. In that moment, Stephen tasted absolute dominion, a total control over another life, a sensation he had long craved in the depths of his fractured soul, with his victim rendered helpless. He carried out his perverse acts, satisfying his darkest fantasies without resistance or refusal. The next morning, victims often woke disoriented, heads pounding, their memories of the night before fragmented and hazy. They might assume they'd overindulged or reacted poorly to an unfamiliar substance. Shame, confusion, and fear of not being believed or even being blamed often led them to choose silence, trying to erase the unsettling experience. This silence became Stephen's ally, reinforcing his belief that he could continue his crimes unpunished, that he was clever enough to outwit everyone. Each successful use of GHB bolstered Stephen's confidence and audacity. He grew more adept at wielding the drug, fine-tuning doses to achieve his desired effect, and more cunning in selecting victims those he believed were less likely to resist or report. He also learned to cover his tracks, crafting plausible stories to deflect any suspicion. The mask of a mild-mannered, reserved neighbor grew ever more convincing, concealing the monster steadily emerging within. The last remnants of Stephen's moral boundaries dissolved completely. Violating another's body, stripping them of agency and awareness, no longer sparked guilt or remorse. Instead, it brought a perverse satisfaction, a confirmation of his power and superiority. GHB didn't just cloud his victims' minds, it acted as a poison that gradually killed off what little humanity remained in Stephen himself. Each drop slipped into a drink was also a dose of venom injected into his own soul, hardening it further into darkness. Stephen's behavior didn't stop at using sedatives for sexual assaults. He began to document his triumphs, filming or photographing his unconscious victims, or the acts he committed, became an integral part of his twisted ritual. This wasn't merely about satisfying a perverse urge, it was a way to relive those moments of control, to extend the fleeting illusion of power. Those videos and images became chilling trophies of his unrelenting descent. These initial crimes, though not yet murderous, marked a fateful, irreversible step on Stephen Port's path to evil. They flung open the door to even more horrific and brutal acts to come. He had tasted the thrill of dominating another human entirely, and he craved it. He had found a formula, a method to fulfill his desires. Regardless of the profound harm and devastating consequences inflicted on others, empathy, compassion, the basic tenets of humanity, were erased from his psyche, replaced by a chilling pragmatism and an insatiable hunger to revel in others' suffering. The world of online dating, with its transient, risky encounters, became the stage for Stephen's dark performances. He hunted in the shadows, meticulously choosing prey he deemed vulnerable and easy to manipulate. And GHB, a chemical some misguidedly called a love drug, became his silent, deadly weapon, guiding him step by step closer to an abyss of unforgivable crimes. The line between good and evil was obliterated, and the demon within, fed by bottomless desires, was fully unleashed, ready for even more heinous acts. The initial success in using GHB to incapacitate and violate victims without detection acted like a potent stimulant, propelling Stephen Port deeper into a spiraling vortex of crime. The cautious fear that once restrained him had vanished, replaced by a growing boldness fueled by each unpunished act and every silenced victim. The doses of GHB he administered began to escalate, not just enough to sedate, but creeping toward a lethal threshold where the line between his perverse pleasure and a victim's wrongful death grew terrifyingly thin. He was playing a deadly game with others' lives, and perhaps even with his own sanity. This escalation wasn't limited to the drug's dosage. The frequency of Stephen's hunts intensified. His need for control and to satisfy his dark desires became an insatiable addiction. He spent increasing hours scouring dating websites, seeking fresh faces, new opportunities to enact his twisted script. Each encounter was a cold calculation, from selecting victims who seemed lonely, trusting, or vulnerable, to orchestrating the setting and preparing his special dose. In Stephen's warped mind, he likely didn't see this as losing control. On the contrary, he may have felt at the peak of mastery over his victims, the situation, and even fate itself. This hubris was another poison, making him ever more reckless and careless. He took greater risks, inviting victims to his apartment more frequently, where evidence of his crimes could more easily be uncovered. Any warning signs were ignored. There may have been moments when a victim reacted too strongly to the drug, when his heart skipped a beat, fearing they might not wake up. But instead of stopping, these near misses only heightened his perverse thrill. He began experimenting with other drugs, combining them with GHB to amplify effects or induce varied states of consciousness in his victims, catering to his increasingly grotesque fantasies. The true loss of control lay in Stephen's inability to stop. The beast within had been unleashed too long, had tasted absolute power too often, and refused to be chained again. He was trapped in a relentless cycle: seek, lure, drug, assault, and then face an emptiness that drove him to hunt anew. This void was perhaps the clearest evidence of his disconnection from reality and human emotion. In rare moments of clarity, a flicker of fear or vague awareness of his sinful path might have surfaced, but these faint glimmers were swiftly drowned by the darkness of his depraved desires. He justified his actions, perhaps blaming his victims, society, or simply refusing to dwell on consequences. Filming and photographing his victims became a fixed ritual, a way to cement his dominance. But also, perhaps, a desperate attempt to cling to moments when he felt most alive. However warped and destructive that life was, Stephen's barking apartment in East London, once an ordinary living space, morphed into a latent crime scene. Its silent walls bore witness to horrific acts, the faint moans, labored breaths of young men stripped of consciousness. The air grew heavy with the scent of chemicals, alcohol, and perhaps the intangible stench of fear. Stephen moved through this space like a deranged warden, a perverse deity in his own small, sick kingdom. The contrast between his daytime and nighttime selves grew stark. By day, he was Stephen, the unassuming chef, perhaps a bit eccentric but harmless, chatting with colleagues, griping about trivialities like anyone else. By night, the mask fell, revealing a ruthless predator devoid of humanity. The escalation of his crimes brought greater risks. A victim might not wake up. Someone might grow suspicious and alert the police. Yet Stephen, intoxicated by power and arrogance, seemed to believe himself untouchable. He was adept at hiding, lying, manipulating others, confident in his ability to control the narrative and deflect scrutiny. However, the increasing doses of GHB were not only dangerous for his victims, but threatened his own criminal enterprise. A slight miscalculation, an unexpected bodily reaction, and everything could spiral out of his control in an instant. The line between incapacitating and killing grew razor thin. He was walking a tightrope above an abyss of death and retribution, but his addiction to control and perverse pleasure clouded his judgment, blinding him to the imminent danger. The darkness in Stephen Port's soul had solidified, leaving no room for light. The silence of his drugged victims became the haunting soundtrack to his escalating atrocities. Any tears shed belonged to the innocent lives he shattered. He seemed incapable of registering others' pain. The path he tread was one way, leading inexorably to a tragic end, not just for his targets, but for himself. His unacknowledged loss of control had begun to seal his fate. The vortex of Stephen Port's depravity had reached a point of no return. The escalating use of GHB, his growing audacity, and the utter erosion of his conscience led to an inevitable, tragic outcome: the death of his first victim. This was no longer an accident born of an overdose in a perverse game. It was a cold, final punctuation mark, signaling Stephen's complete transformation from a serial sexual predator into a murderer. The specter of his first victim began to haunt not only the apartment where the crime occurred, but also the darkest corners of his mind, lingering in the restless nights that were already far from peaceful. Anthony Walgate, a 23-year-old fashion student, was the first to never wake from the game Stephen Port had orchestrated, like those before him. Anthony was lured to Port's barking apartment after connecting through a dating website. The dose of GHB Stephen administered this time perhaps deliberately increased to ensure deeper unconsciousness, or miscalculated with fatal precision, exceeded the young man's body's limits. When Stephen realized Anthony was no longer breathing, a fleeting panic may have crossed his mind, but that panic was swiftly overtaken by cold calculation. A desperate bid to conceal his crime, instead of calling for help or attempting to save Anthony, Stephen chose a path of chilling cruelty and selfishness. He dragged Anthony's body out of the apartment, dumping it near a church not far away, then called emergency services with a fabricated tale of stumbling upon an unconscious man in the street. His voice on the call, as recordings later revealed, carried an eerie calm. He played the part of a concerned passerby, a chance witness. But the lie couldn't mask the horrifying truth. Anthony Walgate's death was no accident. It was the direct result of Stephen Port's deliberate criminal act. When police arrived, Stephen continued his charade, offering information sparingly, steering the investigation away from himself. His clumsy lies and inconsistent details, however, began to raise suspicions. Yet, initially, the police accepted his story, treating Anthony's death as an unclear case of overdose. This early investigative failure unwittingly gave Stephen the freedom to continue his reign of terror. For Stephen, evading suspicion after Anthony's death likely fueled his perverse arrogance. He had crossed a new threshold, the line between life and death, and emerged unscathed. But something shifted within him. The specter of Anthony Walgate, the image of the lifeless body he dragged through the night, began to haunt him. It wasn't true remorse or a pang of conscience, but a new, unsettling fear, a vague sense of disquiet. His sleep may have grown fitful, small noises in the apartment making him startle. Anthony's image might have crept into his warped dreams, not as an accusation, but as a reminder of the deadly power he wielded and the fragility of his own freedom. This haunting presence didn't stop Stephen. If anything, it may have driven him into a deeper state of denial, an urgent need to prove he still held control. He needed to keep hunting, to continue his sick rituals, as if to banish the haunting images and convince himself Anthony's death was merely an unfortunate occupational hazard in the underworld he'd created. Yet this first death left an indelible mark. It wasn't just another name on a list, but a pivotal event that redefined his crimes. Stephen Port was no longer merely a serial rapist, he was a killer. Each subsequent victim would only deepen the imprint of the monster within. The police may have initially overlooked the signs, but Anthony Walgate's specter did not. It lingered in the walls of the barking apartment, in Stephen's dreams, and perhaps in the very air around him, a silent warning, a prophecy of inevitable retribution. The silence surrounding Anthony's death, the flawed initial investigation. The community, unaware of the lurking danger, allowed Stephen to continue spreading terror. But that silence couldn't last forever. Blood had been spilled, and it would not stop crying out until justice was served. The specter of his first victim was an invisible yet potent force. It was more than a memory, a presence, a constant reminder of an undeniable crime. It crept into Stephen's solitary moments, whispering words only he could hear, sowing a faint but persistent fear, no matter how he tried to ignore it, to bury it beneath new layers of crime. That specter remained, waiting, a silent witness to the complete collapse of a soul. After Anthony Walgate's death, Stephen Port didn't pause. Instead, he sank deeper into the quagmire of his crimes, cloaking his true nature behind a facade of chilling normalcy. His double life grew more sophisticated, a stark division between the quiet, slightly eccentric chef by day and the monstrous predator lurking in the shadows of online dating by night. This duality wasn't just a cover, it was evidence of a deepening personality split, where two realities coexisted within one man. By day, Stephen Port continued his work as a chef, likely in a bus depot canteen or modest restaurant. He showed up on time, chopped ingredients, cooked and cleaned, performing the mundane tasks of daily life. Colleagues might have described him as reserved, socially distant, perhaps a bit odd, but none could fathom the horrors he concealed. He engaged in superficial small talk, grumbling about the weather, or commenting on a football match, maintaining the illusion of a normal life while reinforcing his invisible mask. He lived in a small apartment in Barking, a bustling East London neighborhood. Neighbors might have occasionally passed him in the hallway, exchanging perfunctory greetings or nods, if they noticed unfamiliar young men entering or leaving his flat. They paid little mind, the apathy of modern urban life, where people retreat into their own worlds, unwittingly aided his crimes. But when night fell, or free time arose, another Stephen emerged. He immersed himself in the virtual realm of gay dating apps like Grindr, Badoo, or Sleepy Boy, using fake names and possibly doctored photos. He crafted enticing profiles to lure prey. He might pose as a wealthy man, a generous host, or simply someone seeking fun. Online, his words could be charming, seductive, a stark contrast to his subdued daytime persona. His next victims, Gabriel Cavari and Daniel Whitworth, were drawn into his trap much like Anthony, young, perhaps lonely, or seeking connection. They had no inkling that the man promising good times was a cold-blooded predator. Stephen's sophistication lay in his ability to switch seamlessly between personas. He could commit a heinous act, dispose of a body, then head to work, preparing breakfast for others as if nothing had happened. His absence of guilt and chilling indifference to his actions made him uniquely dangerous. His apartment, the crime scene, was meticulously cleaned after each encounter. He erased Trace's hair, fingerprints, the smallest stains using cleaning chemicals with precision. This carefulness revealed a calculating mind, fully aware of his actions, not one lost to madness. Yet, maintaining this double life must have created unseen pressures. He had to stay vigilant, always on guard. A knock at the door or an unfamiliar phone number could jolt him. The fear of discovery, though buried deep, simmered. Perhaps this pressure, coupled with the growing emptiness after each crime, drove him to seek new hunts as a release, a way to reassert control. The contrast between light and darkness in Stephen's life was stark. The artificial, pallid light of his daytime routine strained to conceal the inky blackness of his crimes. Victims' blood stained his hands, but he scrubbed it away with daily routines and an innocuous facade. Families wept, yet his face remained dry, impassive. His apartment's silent walls bore witness to both Stephen's, the seemingly ordinary man, and the ruthless monster. They heard the sweet lies typed online and the final moans of innocent victims. This double life couldn't last forever. Each lie, each cover-up, built an invisible prison around him. That wall would, sooner or later, crumble, exposing Stephen Port's true self to the light of justice. But until then, he continued his performance a play for the world, with a serial killer masquerading as an ordinary man. Deception had become his second skin, encasing a soul utterly decayed. Amid Stephen Port's increasingly dense web of crimes, despite his hardened arrogance, there were moments, unexpected incidents that cracked his cold facade, exposing flickers of panic and a persistent unease. One case, or a specific detail tied to a victim, haunted him differently, planting a vague fear that perhaps he wasn't as in control as he believed. It was the first whisper of retribution, a warning from the unseen that his crimes could not remain hidden forever. Perhaps it was the case of Jack Taylor, his fourth and final victim. Unlike those before, Jack's family and friends were relentless in their pursuit of justice. They rejected the police's initial explanation of an unclear overdose death, conducting their own inquiries, gathering evidence, and pressuring authorities. Their tenacity sparked public attention Stephen hadn't anticipated. This fierce response from Jack's loved ones likely unsettled him. He was accustomed to silence, to victims' resigned fates or lackluster investigations. But now, a force driven by love and a hunger for justice confronted him. Their voices, initially mere whispers, grew into an unrelenting accusation. The haunting might not have come from external pressure alone, but from the crime itself, in disposing of Jack's body. Stephen may have slipped, leaving a trace, a stray hair, a faint fingerprint, an overlooked personal item, for someone obsessed with control and perfection in concealing his crimes. Such a detail could have sparked acute anxiety. He likely replayed that night's actions obsessively, scrutinizing every moment for errors. The fear that a single misstep could lead police to his door became a psychological burden. Sleepless nights may have multiplied. A strange noise or a car's headlights flashing past his window could set his heart racing. This haunting might have taken a more spectral form. Even if Stephen wasn't superstitious, images of Jack Taylor, or all his victims, may have begun invading his dreams. No longer vague, but vivid and persistent, not true ghosts, but reflections of his guilt. An unconscious self-punishment. The whispers in the night weren't just physical sounds, but invasive thoughts, nameless fears. He might have felt watched, not by police, but by an intangible force. As if his every move was being recorded, his confidence in his control began to waver. This panic wasn't enough to make Stephen stop or confess. Instead, it may have driven him to be more cautious in his cover-ups or, conversely, more reckless in a desperate bid to reassert his dominance, to prove he still controlled the game. Jack Taylor's case, with his family's resolve, shifted the tide. It not only drew public scrutiny, but forced police to re-examine the similar deaths of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, and Daniel Whitworth. Suspicious patterns emerged, and Stephen Port, once merely a witness in Anthony's case, became a prime suspect. For Stephen, this was a nightmare materializing. He had worked tirelessly to keep his two worlds separate, but those walls were now crumbling. The whispers in the night were no longer vague hallucinations. They were becoming the roar of approaching justice. This haunting and panic revealed that, despite his cruelty, Stephen Port was human, with latent fears and weaknesses. He wasn't an omnipotent demon, but a criminal fleeing the darkness he'd created. And that darkness was beginning to engulf him. The Taylor's persistence, combined with Stephen's possible errors in his arrogance, cracked his perfect facade. That small fissure let in the light of truth, turning haunting whispers into undeniable accusations. The chase, both tangible and intangible, had truly begun. The feeling of being watched was no longer a fleeting or vague fear in Stephen Port's mind. It had become an entrenched belief, a constant obsession seeping into every moment of his double life. Beyond the fear of police investigation, a deeper dread took hold, a conviction that something was tracking him. An inexplicable, invisible force observing his every move, listening to his every thought. This belief wasn't rooted in reason, but sprouted from a guilty soul eroding under its own darkness. Stephen's nights grew heavier. Sleep, if it came, was fitful, plagued by nightmares. In those dreams, he didn't just see his victims' faces, but felt unseen eyes, staring from the shadows, eyes that didn't judge or rage, but simply watched with a cold, piercing scrutiny that terrified him. He'd wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, straining to hear any sound in his apartment, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the feeling didn't fade with daylight, even amidst daily routines. An invisible weight pressed on him. On the street, he'd glance over his shoulder, checking for followers. In his apartment, he might sit motionless for hours, attuned to the slightest noise, wondering if something else was present. The silence of his once private crime scene now felt oppressive, threatening. He began fixating on trivial coincidences, ascribing them supernatural significance. A black bird on his windowsill, a book falling from a shelf, a flickering light, all became omens, warnings from that force, his mind, long accustomed to twisting reality to serve his perverse desires, now warped it to fit his growing paranoia. This belief wasn't entirely irrational from a psychological perspective. It was a projection of his guilt, the faint whisper of a conscience, though trampled and buried, struggling to surface in a distorted form. Unable to face the truth that his actions birthed this fear, he externalized it as an otherworldly presence. This made Stephen's life more tense and isolated. He couldn't share this fear with anyone. Admitting belief in being haunted or followed by demons would expose weakness, a loss of control he refused to acknowledge, so he kept it locked inside, letting it gnaw at him, turning him into a paranoid figure perpetually on edge. This unseen presence didn't seem intent on physical harm, at least not yet. It simply existed, watching, a constant reminder of his deeds. It stripped him of peace. Even in moments he tried to forget his crimes, whenever he sought fleeting joy or distraction. The sense of being watched surged back, a dark cloud overshadowing everything. Perhaps this something was the weight of his victims' restless souls: Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, Jack Taylor, whose names and faces were no longer mere memories, but part of the oppressive atmosphere around him. Their blood had seeped into his apartment's walls, their final cries echoing in its silence. This belief likely influenced his behavior. He might have grown excessively cautious, or, conversely, recklessly defiant to prove he wasn't afraid, that he remained in control. But the feeling of being watched clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. This psychological torment, though not a formal sentence, was a form of punishment. It eroded his spirit, trapping him in an invisible prison of his own making, where fear formed the bars and his victims' specters were the wardens. He may have evaded legal consequences for a time, but he couldn't escape the judgment of his own warped conscience, manifesting as a supernatural force. As the police investigation closed in and evidence mounted, the tangible fear of arrest might have overshadowed this intangible dread. But in his solitary moments, during sleepless nights, the belief that something was watching persisted, a reminder that some crimes time cannot erase, and some specters will not rest until justice is served. This was the start of a spiritual chase, where the hunted fled not just the law, but himself. The heaven's net is vast and wide, yet none escape its mesh. Despite Stephen Port's meticulous efforts to conceal his crimes with a sophisticated veneer, despite his delusions of control and invincibility, the day of reckoning arrived. The moment his apartment door was forced open or cold handcuffs snapped around his wrists marked not only the end of his sinful freedom, but also a direct confrontation with the consequences of his heinous acts. Yet, for Stephen, the greatest fear was not the gray prison walls or the impending sentence. It was the invisible shadow that had clung to him through those long nights. A terror he believed surpassed even the law's punishment. His arrest followed a complex, challenging investigation, marred by initial police oversights that gave the killer time to continue his spree. The relentless persistence of the victims' families, particularly Jack Taylor's, combined with irrefutable forensic evidence, phone data, browsing history, and traces of GHB in the victims' bodies, tightened the noose around the murderer. When police stormed in, Stephen may not have been entirely surprised. The vague fear of discovery had simmered within him, especially after Jack Taylor's death and the growing media spotlight. Yet the tangible presence of law enforcement, their stern gazes, and their damning accusations were a shock. The mask of normalcy he'd so carefully crafted shattered into pieces. His true self, a cold-blooded serial killer, was laid bare in that moment of arrest. He likely tried to maintain his composure, clinging to the role of an innocent man wronged, but his eyes may have betrayed panic, desperation. The world he'd meticulously constructed, where he reigned supreme, collapsed entirely. As he was led away through flashing cameras and the crowd's curious, hateful stares, Stephen likely felt profound humiliation, a total loss of power. But deeper still, another fear gnawed at him, the dread of the shadow in the night, the something watching that had haunted him. In his warped mind, his arrest wasn't solely the result of police work. He may have believed that shadow had guided the authorities to him, part of a supernatural plan of retribution. This irrational fear held immense power over a soul distorted by crime. Prison, with its cold walls, heavy bars, and constant surveillance, was a harsh reality. But, for Stephen, it held another meaning, a space where he could no longer flee that shadow, in the solitude of his cell, without the distraction of hunts or the facade of a double life. He would face his obsessions head on. The shadow in the night wasn't something that could be handcuffed or confined. It was part of him, born of his guilt. It would follow him into prison, slipping through cell doors, whispering in sleepless nights, reminding him of his victims, his atrocities, and his inevitable downfall. The fear of legal consequences, lifelong imprisonment, was tangible, measurable, but the fear of the shadow was boundless, formless, and thus far more terrifying. It threatened not just his physical freedom but his sanity, the last scraps of peace in his soul, in his cell, awaiting trial. Stephen might have dwelled more on that shadow than the evidence against him. He may have searched for explanations, meaning were these the vengeful spirits of his victims, a supernatural entity dispensing its own justice? This tug of war between tangible and intangible fears was central to Stephen Port's psychological collapse. He was captured by the law, but also imprisoned by his own hauntings. His true prison wasn't the concrete walls, but the darkness within, where the shadow reigned. Stephen Port's free life was over, but his battle with the shadow in the night was just beginning. In that battle, no lawyer could defend him. No sentence could offer release. It was a private punishment, a spiritual judgment he would face alone in fear and isolation. The heaven's net had closed, and the shadow, more terrifying than any prison, awaited him in the dark. The trial of Stephen Port was more than a legal proceeding to determine guilt and mete out punishment. For many, especially the victims' families and those who followed the case with horror, it held a deeper significance, akin to a spiritual reckoning. It was a ritual where his heinous crimes were laid bare under the light of justice, and where the restless souls of the departed seemed to linger, demanding fairness. In the dock, Stephen faced not only the judge and jury, but also the crushing weight of his undeniable sins and, perhaps, the invisible eyes he always felt watching him. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy. Silence was occasionally broken by the stifled sobs of victims' families or the prosecutor's steely recitation of Stephen's atrocities. Images of the victims Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, Jack Taylor flashed on screens, their youthful, vibrant faces now reduced to painful memories. Every detail was dissected. Stephen's luring of victims online, his use of GHB to incapacitate them, his sexual assaults, and his cold disposal of their bodies. Throughout the trial, Stephen maintained a blank expression, head bowed or staring blankly. Was he trying to project calm, masking a trembling soul gripped by fear of the irrefutable evidence and the weight of judgment? Or was it the ultimate callousness of a man stripped of humanity? For those with spiritual beliefs, the courtroom was more than a place of human law. It was a sacred space where universal moral laws were affirmed. Each witness's testimony, each piece of evidence, served not only to convict Stephen, but also to honor the departed, acknowledging the pain endured by them and their families. In Stephen's warped mind, the trial may have carried a dual meaning. On one hand, it was society's judgment, the law's verdict. On the other, it felt like the culmination of the watching he'd sensed for so long. The shadow in the night. That something watching seemed more present than ever, not just in his mind, but in the gazes of those in the courtroom, in the tense silence, in the heavy air. He may have felt judged not only by people, but by an unseen, potent tribunal of conscience. His defense's arguments, however valiant, crumbled against the damning evidence and the brutality of his crimes. The lies and fabricated stories he'd used to conceal his actions were ruthlessly exposed. The truth, however painful and revolting, was finally revealed. As the jury deliberated, the tension was palpable, not just for a legal verdict, but for an end to the victim's family's suffering, a confirmation that justice still existed. When the guilty verdicts were read for rape, sexual assault, and murder, a bittersweet relief, tinged with sorrow, spread through the courtroom. The life sentence without parole was a fitting punishment for Stephen's unforgivable crimes, but for those who believed in a deeper judgment, the legal sentence was only part of it. The true reckoning, the spiritual punishment, had begun long ago with the shadow that clung to him and would follow him forever. Even behind bars, the trial ended, but its echoes lingered. It was more than a criminal case. It was a warning about society's dark corners, the dangers of predators hiding behind screens, and the need to listen to, trust, and protect the vulnerable. For Stephen, the trial was a perverse purification ritual. His darkest secrets were exposed, his crimes named. He could no longer hide or evade. whether he admitted it or felt remorse. The truth was public. In some decayed corner of his ruined soul, this exposure, however humiliating, might have brought a twisted relief from the burden of secrecy, but the shadow in the night remained. It didn't vanish after the trial. It became his sole companion in the long years of imprisonment, a constant reminder of a spiritual judgment no human sentence could fully replace. The courtroom doors closed, but the tribunal of his conscience continued its session, its verdict eternal. The heavy iron gates of Belmarsh, or another maximum security prison, slammed shut behind Stephen Port, their harsh, final clang marking the end of his life of freedom. Within the cold, gray walls, only silence remained, not a peaceful silence, but a thick, oppressive hush, forcing him to confront himself, his indelible crimes, and the relentless echoes of a past he could not escape. The prison became an absolute isolation chamber, a microcosm where time seemed to freeze, and the darkness within him took on a sharper, more vivid form than ever before. Those first days in prison were likely a shock, even if he had braced himself. The complete loss of freedom, the strict control of guards, the rigid rules, and the presence of other inmates, each with their own dark stories, created a brutal environment. Stephen, who once saw himself as the master of his perverse world, was now reduced to a number, a prisoner like any other. The prison's clamor, clanging gates, hurried footsteps, shouts sometimes gave way to a more terrifying silence, especially at night in the confines of his cell, in those quiet moments. The echoes of his past grew louder. Anthony Walgate's laughter before sipping the poisoned drink, Gabriel Cavari's whispers, Daniel Whitworth's faint breaths, Jack Taylor's final gaze, these images and sounds, no longer drowned out by new hunts or fabricated lies, invaded his mind, replaying like a broken tape. The shadow in the night he once sensed found a perfect home in the solitude of his cell, without crowded streets to hide in or computer screens to shield him. Stephen faced this invisible presence directly. It was no longer a vague feeling, but an unwilling companion, a silent witness to his inner torment. The prison's silence was also a silence of judgment. Gone were the prosecutor's accusations and the victim's family's hateful stares, but a heavier judgment remained, that of his own conscience. However calloused, in the cell's solitude, its walls became mirrors reflecting his entire criminal life. He could not escape the image of himself as a serial killer, a demon in human guise. At first, he might have tried to deny it, blaming circumstances, society, or even his victims. But silence and isolation have a fearsome power, stripping away defensive facades to reveal raw truth. His lies were useless when there was no one to deceive but himself. The loss of physical freedom paled compared to the loss of mental autonomy. In prison, Stephen had no choices, no control, for someone obsessed with dominating others. This powerlessness was a cruel torment. Days dragged on, monotonous and bleak fixed schedules, tasteless meals, hostile or indifferent faces. In such an environment, the mind can weaken or sharpen in self-reflection. For Stephen, it was likely both. He might have sunk into despair, self-loathing, or sought escape in his thoughts. The echoes from his cell weren't just of past crimes, but of a hopeless future. A life sentence without parole meant he would die in prison, no hope of freedom. No chance to start anew, only the wait for death in solitude and oblivion. Yet the prison's silence could also offer a faint chance for repentance. At rock bottom, with nothing left to lose, some confront their lives more honestly. The painful echoes of his crimes might serve as a call to face the truth, to accept responsibility. But for a soul long shrouded in darkness like Stephen's, the path to genuine remorse is arduous. The prison's silence is merely a starting point, a space where seeds of repentance, if any exist, might sprout. For those seeds to grow, he would need an external catalyst or a profound internal shift. Until then, he remains imprisoned, not just by concrete walls, but by the unrelenting echoes of his sinful past, in the solitude and ceaseless echoes of guilt within his cell. A faint, unexpected ray of light pierced the dense darkness of Stephen Port's existence. This wasn't a miraculous event or supernatural intervention, but a simple encounter, an interaction that seemed mundane in the prison's harsh environment, yet held the power to stir long-buried emotions in his calloused heart. It might have been an elderly priest visiting inmates, a fellow prisoner with a redemptive past, or even a letter from a stranger, carrying words of unexpected compassion. Imagine it was a priest, an older man with kind eyes and a warm, steady voice. He didn't come to preach dogma or condemn Stephen further. He simply arrived, listened, and shared stories of faith, forgiveness, and hope, even in the darkest circumstances. At first, Stephen might have been skeptical, defensive, even hostile. So accustomed was he to distrust and fortifying walls around himself. But the priest's gentle persistence began to thaw that icy facade. He didn't force Stephen to believe or repent. He merely planted seeds of reflection, offering a new perspective on his life. He spoke of God's unconditional love, of forgiveness possible even for the gravest sins, if one truly sought it. Alternatively, the light could have come from a fellow inmate, someone who had committed serious crimes but found a path to redemption, a new purpose behind bars. This man might have shared his story not to boast, but to show that change was possible, that it was never too late to seek atonement. His sincere words, born from shared hardship, could resonate more deeply than any moral lecture. Or perhaps it was a letter from a stranger who followed Stephen's case and, instead of condemnation, wrote lines filled with empathy not for his crimes, but for a man lost to darkness. The letter might pose questions that forced Stephen to think, or simply remind him that even at his lowest, a spark of humanity, a yearning for redemption, could still exist. This encounter, whatever its form, touched a deep, forgotten place in Stephen's soul, a place he thought long dead. It didn't erase his guilt or lessen the horror of his deeds, but it opened a new possibility, a path beyond despair and self-destruction. For the first time in ages, Stephen might have felt something beyond emptiness, fear, or hatred, perhaps curiosity, a fragile hope, or surprise at realizing someone saw him as a person, not just a monster. This ray of light wasn't a transformative moment, but a beginning, a stirring. It was like a seed planted in the barren soil of his soul. For it to grow, it would need time, nurturing, and most crucially, Stephen's willingness to face the truth and embark on repentance. The priest, the inmate, or the letter's author weren't saviors. They were bearers of light, guides pointing the way. The rest of the journey was Stephen's to walk. But now, he was no longer entirely engulfed in darkness. A faint hope glimmered that there might be some form of redemption, not from his legal sentence, but for his ravaged soul. This encounter marks a pivotal shift in the latter, fictional part of the narrative. It opens the door to reflection, remorse, and redemption. It shows that even in the darkest places, the gentle light of compassion and faith can shine, and no one is entirely beyond the chance for forgiveness, no matter the magnitude of their sins. This spark is the catalyst Stephen needs to begin confronting his memories and truly reckoning with his conscience. The fragile ray of light from that fateful encounter, whether with the compassionate priest, the redeemed fellow inmate, or the heartfelt letter, did not flicker out in the darkness of Stephen Port's cell. Instead, it burned like a small candle, illuminating the deepest, darkest corners of his soul, sparking a painful but necessary process, revisiting his memories, and for the first time, truly confronting his crimes, not with denial or self-justification, but with a bitter acknowledgement, a belated confession to his long-tormented conscience. The solitude of prison, once a torment, now became a vital space for self-reflection under this new light, stripped of distractions and masks. Stephen embarked on a journey back through his past, not to find excuses, but to understand the monster he had become. Memories, once fleeting and haunting in nightmares, now surfaced with excruciating clarity. He recalled his lonely childhood, the alienation, the first cracks in his faith, no longer blaming circumstances. He recognized that his own choices, his unchecked, perverse desires had led him down a sinful path. He revisited his first crimes, the use of GHB, the warped sense of power he felt controlling others. He shuddered at his callousness toward his victim's helplessness, the sick satisfaction he once derived, the mask of a cunning, Superior predator began to crack, revealing a weak, contemptible man driven by base urges. Most painful was confronting the memories of those he killed: Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, Jack Taylor. Their faces were no longer vague specters, but real people with dreams and lives he had brutally stolen. He recalled the lies he told their families and the police, the coldness with which he disposed of their bodies. Each detail stabbed at his hardened heart, rekindling emotions he thought long-lost: remorse, shame, and an unrelenting pain. This was no easy process. At times, Stephen wanted to retreat to his old indifference, the pain of truth too overwhelming to bear, but that faint light kept urging him forward. The priest's words about forgiveness, the inmate's story of redemption, or the letter's hopeful lines became an invisible force, helping him push through moments of weakness in the cell's silence. Stephen began to write not to justify or narrate, but to confess. He documented every act, sparing no grotesque or painful detail, as a means of release, confrontation, and acknowledgement. The pages were stained not just with ink, but with belated tears, tears of genuine remorse, shed for the first time in years. This confession wasn't for the police or the courts. His legal sentence had been passed. It was for himself, his conscience, and perhaps the restless souls of his victims in an attempt to cleanse, even slightly, the stains he had left. This process also shifted how he viewed the shadow in the night, or something watching. No longer an external supernatural force punishing him, he began to see it as a reflection of his own guilt, his conscience struggling to surface. The shadow wasn't there to terrify, but to remind him of the truth and the need for repentance. The inner conflict persisted, but its nature changed. It was no longer about hiding or fearing exposure, but about grappling with remorse and a longing for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. This marked a crucial turning point in Stephen's spiritual journey. He moved beyond denial to face the truth about himself. His confession to his conscience, though late, was a courageous act, a sign that the spark of hope hadn't fully died. It paved the way for further steps toward atonement and inner peace, though the path remained long and fraught. The prison's silence was no longer just a physical confinement, but a battleground for a fierce internal struggle, where light and darkness vied for control of a sinful soul. After days immersed in recounting and writing confessions to his conscience, a profound shift stirred within Stephen Port. The pain of remorse didn't vanish, but it no longer carried the silent despair of before. Instead, it became a driving force, an urgent push to do something, however small, to express his repentance, in the solitude of his cell, amidst cold concrete walls. Stephen uttered his first true prayer, not hollow mutterings or a ritualistic formality, but a raw cry from the depths of his shattered soul, a sincere plea, uncertain if it would be heard or accepted. This prayer didn't come easily. Stephen had never been religious. His childhood lacked spiritual anchors, and his years steeped in sin distanced him further from notions of faith or God. Even the priest's words, initially met with skepticism, had only slowly begun to pierce his cynical shell, but the spark ignited by the priest, combined with the painful process of self-reflection, gradually melted that icy doubt. It was late at night, the prison steeped in near absolute silence. Stephen sat on his hard cot, his confession pages beside him. He felt an overwhelming emptiness, but also a powerful urge. He didn't know where to begin or what to say. He had never learned to pray. Then, halting, clumsy words spilled out, unbound by any script. They weren't pleas for his own forgiveness, not yet. His first thoughts were of his victims. He named them Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, Jack. He pictured their faces not in their moments of helplessness under his hands, but alive, full of hope. He prayed for their souls to find peace, to be freed. He begged their forgiveness, knowing his apologies might never reach them or ease the pain he caused. Tears fell again, not of self-pity, but of genuine anguish for the irreparable losses he had inflicted. He felt the weight of each life he destroyed, the futures he extinguished. Next, he prayed for the victims' families, knowing their pain was boundless, that no apology could lessen their loss. Still, he prayed for their peace, for strength to carry on a self-inflicted punishment, to feel a fraction of the suffering he caused. Only then did he dare turn to himself. His prayer wasn't for release from prison or escape from punishment. He knew he deserved it all. He prayed for an inner change, for his soul to be cleansed, even slightly. He sought strength to face his remaining years in prison, not with hatred or despair, but with acceptance and an effort to live a life, though confined, with more meaning and conscience. His prayer lacked polished words or memorized verses. It was a silent dialogue, a pouring out of his heart to a higher power he was only beginning to sense. It was an act of fragile, nascent faith. Nascent. When it ended, Stephen felt an unfamiliar lightness, not joy, but a delicate peace, as if an invisible burden had lifted slightly. The cell's darkness seemed less oppressive. The shadow in the night softened, no longer menacing, but a quiet presence, witnessing his change, for the first time. Stephen didn't feel utterly alone. Though rejected by the world, though his sins were unforgivable to many, he sensed a connection, a hope that his feeble prayer had been heard. This prayer wasn't an ending, but a new beginning in his spiritual journey. It was a silent vow to live differently, to seek redemption for his soul. However arduous the path, it proved that even in the darkest hearts, seeds of faith and repentance could sprout if nurtured by sincerity and a longing for change. The silence after his prayer was no longer one of despair, but of anticipation, of faith in some form of forgiveness. Perhaps not from humanity, but from an unseen realm. Blood and tears had mingled in his sinful past. But now, tears of remorse and heartfelt prayers began to wash away some of that stain, paving the way for a final peace, if only at life's end. The final years of Stephen Port's life passed in the near absolute stillness of his cell, a stillness no longer colored by fear or frenzied torment, but gradually shifting to acceptance. A strange serenity. That first prayer had opened a new path in his soul, one of quiet repentance, of seeking purification through each remaining day. His health, already frail, steadily declined, but his mind found a clarity and peace he had never known. The shadow in the night no longer haunted him negatively. Instead, he sensed the presence of his victims' spirits as silent companions, owed apologies he could never deliver directly, but could express through small acts and kinder thoughts. He spent hours reading the scriptures left by the priest, not for easy salvation, but to explore compassion, forgiveness, and love, values he had rejected for most of his life. His confession pages remained, but he no longer read them with horror or self-loathing. They were relics of his former self, a man he was striving to leave behind, though he knew the past could never be fully erased. Occasionally, he wrote not of crimes, but of new reflections, fragile hopes for some form of forgiveness, even if only from himself. He spoke little with other inmates, not out of fear or disdain, but because he found sufficiency in his inner world when opportunities arose. He did small acts of good, helping elderly prisoners or listening to their stories without judgment. These were his attempts to repay life, though he knew they could never offset the immense harm he caused. Physical pain became frequent, but Stephen faced it with resignation, viewing it as part of his punishment, a necessary cleansing. In his worst moments, he turned to prayer not to escape suffering, but to seek strength to endure and maintain his newfound calm. Images of blood and violence faded, replaced by quieter visions, faint light through his cell's window, worn Bible pages, the priest's kind face. Screams and moans gave way to whispered prayers and the soft rustle of turning pages. Then came the day his breaths grew faint. He knew death was near. There was no panic, no clinging to life, only tranquil acceptance. Lying on a simple infirmary cot, he gazed at a small patch of sky through a window. In his final moments, his mind didn't swirl with past sins or fear of punishment. He thought of his victims again, but with a strange peace, as if believing they had found rest and, perhaps, no longer hated him. He thought of the priest, grateful for the light brought to his final days. No family stood by, no hand held his. Stephen Port's death was solitary, as much of his life had been, but this solitude was no longer tragic, it was serene, a gentle departure. When his final breath ceased, his face bore no tension or pain, only a hint of peace, as if a long journey of sin and torment had finally ended, his soul finding a sliver of stillness after endless strife. His death stirred little outside notice to the world. He was a serial killer who paid his debt. But in this story, it held deeper meaning, the close of a belated repentance, a final release from guilt's burden. The blood and horrors of his past receded, replaced by an enveloping stillness. Dawn's faint light filtered through the infirmary's small window, bathing his lifeless face in rare peace. No more sleepless nights, no more echoes from hell, only a deep, eternal silence. Perhaps, somewhere, his victims' souls found true peace. And perhaps, Stephen's guilty soul, after its final journey of repentance, found a trace of calm, even if only in the void. All sank into stillness. The night of crime had passed, giving way to a quiet end, not loud, but perhaps not entirely without meaning.